The hospital hallway was almost empty when Marcus Reed heard the little girl crying behind the locked doors of the children's ward. It was nearly midnight in Chicago, Illinois, and outside, snow was falling over the city, like a blanket trying to hide all the pain underneath it. Marcus had spent the last 11 years working nights as a maintenance supervisor at St. Catherine Medical Center, but that night he was carrying something heavier than any broken machine or a leaking pipe. He had just learned that his 8-year-old son, Noah, might need an expensive surgery his insurance would not fully cover. Marcus had been trying to stay strong for his boy, but as he stood beneath the cold fluorescent lights, he suddenly heard a child whisper through the door, asking if anyone had come to take her home. Marcus froze. He knew that voice. It belonged to a little girl who had been sitting alone in the same hospital room for 3 days. If you believe kindness can change a life, even when nobody is watching, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes one small act of compassion becomes the beginning of an entirely different life. The little girl's name was Grace Miller. She was 9 years old, thin, pale, and always carried a faded blue backpack against her chest as if it were the only thing in the world she could trust. Marcus had first noticed her 3 days earlier when he was repairing a broken heater outside the pediatric ward. Nurses moved around her room constantly, doctors checked her charts, and meals appeared beside her bed, but no family member ever came through the door. Marcus had seen lonely children before, but something about Grace was different. She never complained. She never asked for toys. She simply stared through the window toward the parking lot every evening, waiting for someone who never came. That night, Marcus discovered why. Grace's mother had died unexpectedly from complications following a severe illness, and her father had never been part of her life. Social services had been trying to locate a distant relative, but until then, the hospital was the only place Grace had. Marcus stood outside her door, knowing he should probably call a nurse, yet something inside him made him stay. He slowly pushed the door open and found Grace sitting beneath a thin blanket, holding her blue backpack tightly. Marcus did not ask her why she was crying. He simply sat in the chair beside her bed. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with the soft beeping of medical equipment and the distant sounds of nurses walking through the corridor. Finally, Grace opened her backpack and pulled out a small photograph. It showed her and her mother standing beside a Christmas tree in a tiny apartment. Her mother was smiling, and Grace was holding a handmade paper star. Marcus looked at the picture and then at the child, and for the first time that night, he understood that sometimes people do not need someone to fix their problems. Sometimes they simply need someone willing to sit beside them while the world feels unbearable. Marcus stayed until Grace fell asleep. Then he quietly returned to work, but he could not stop thinking about her. His own problems were already overwhelming. He was a single father raising Noah alone after his wife had passed away several years earlier. He worked overtime whenever he could, skipped meals to save money, and kept a second job repairing appliances on weekends. His apartment was modest, his car was old, and his savings were nearly gone because Noah's medical bills had swallowed everything. Yet somehow, when Marcus looked at Grace, his own worries seemed less important. Over the next week, Marcus began bringing Grace small things from home. One evening, it was a warm pair of socks. Another night, it was a paperback book Noah had finished reading. He never told anyone how much he was struggling. He simply believed that if his son were alone in a hospital bed, he would hope someone would care enough to do the same. Then something unexpected happened. Noah came to the hospital with Marcus one Saturday afternoon. Marcus had brought him along because he could not afford a babysitter. Noah was a quiet 10-year-old who had learned too early that his father was always tired. When he saw Grace sitting alone in the ward's playroom, he immediately walked over and offered her the small wooden airplane he had carried in his pocket for years. Grace looked at the airplane as if Noah had handed her a treasure. The two children began playing together, and Marcus watched from the doorway with tears gathering in his eyes. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Grace laughed. But Marcus did not know that someone else had been watching too. Her name was Rebecca Sullivan, the hospital's chief financial officer. Rebecca had noticed Marcus several times during her late shifts. She had seen him working long after everyone else had gone home, fixing broken equipment, cleaning flooded hallways, and quietly checking on patients who had no visitors. She had also noticed that Marcus sometimes stood outside the hospital cafeteria without buying food because he was trying to save every dollar. One evening, Rebecca discovered the truth when she accidentally saw a medical bill sticking out of Marcus's work folder. It showed the projected cost of Noah's surgery. The amount was more than Marcus could possibly afford. Rebecca asked the hospital administration whether there was any assistance available. Unfortunately, the hospital's charity fund had strict requirements, and Marcus did not qualify for enough support. Rebecca wanted to help, but she knew giving him money personally might create problems at work. Then she remembered Grace. Grace was scheduled to be discharged soon, but social services had still been unable to locate a safe relative. She might be transferred into temporary foster care. Marcus knew this, and had become visibly distressed. He never said anything inappropriate or tried to interfere with the process, but everyone could see how deeply he cared about the child. 3 days before Grace's discharge, a storm hit Chicago. Snow covered the roads, flights were delayed, and the city disappeared beneath freezing winds. Marcus arrived for his shift and discovered that Grace's temporary placement had suddenly fallen through. She had nowhere to go. That evening, Marcus stood outside her hospital room with his heart breaking. He knew he could not simply take her home. He already struggled to provide for Noah. He did not have a large house, unlimited money, or a perfect life. All he had was a small apartment, a tired heart, and a willingness to love someone who needed it. He went home that night and sat at the kitchen table while Noah slept in the next room. He stared at the unpaid bills scattered across the table. Then he looked at a photograph of his late wife and remembered something she had once told him. A family was not measured by the size of a house, but by the number of people who felt safe inside it. The next morning, Marcus went to social services and asked what would be required for him to become Grace's temporary foster guardian. The process was complicated. Background checks, financial reviews, home inspections, paperwork, interviews, and legal approvals all stood in his way. More than once, Marcus thought about giving up. How could a struggling single father possibly convince anyone that he was capable of raising another child? But then Grace called him by name. That was enough. Weeks passed. Marcus worked every hour he could. Rebecca quietly helped connect him with a hospital assistance program and a community foundation that supported children and families facing medical crises. Noah's surgery was finally approved at a much lower cost through a charitable medical grant. Marcus cried when he received the news. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because for the first time in months, he could see a path forward. Then came the home inspection. Marcus cleaned his tiny apartment until his hands hurt. Noah proudly arranged his books. Grace sat quietly on the couch, afraid that one wrong answer might make everything disappear. When the social worker finished inspecting the home, she looked around and saw something no checklist could measure. There were 3 coats hanging beside the door. 3 pairs of shoes rested on the floor. 3 toothbrushes sat in the bathroom. It was no longer just Marcus and Noah. It was becoming a family. Months later, Grace officially became part of Marcus's household. There were still difficult days. Money remained tight. Marcus still worked long hours. Noah still had medical appointments. Grace sometimes woke from nightmares and cried because she was afraid another person she loved would disappear. But Marcus always came when she called. Years passed, and the little girl with the faded blue backpack grew into a confident young woman. Grace never forgot the night Marcus sat beside her hospital bed when everyone else had gone home. She studied hard, earned scholarships, and eventually became a pediatric social worker. Her mission was simple: make sure no child ever felt forgotten in a hospital room. One Christmas evening, many years after that snowy night, Marcus sat at the same small kitchen table with Noah and Grace. Noah had recovered completely and was studying to become a physical therapist. Grace had returned from college for the holidays. The apartment was still modest, and Marcus still preferred repairing things instead of replacing them, but the table was surrounded by people who loved one another. Grace placed a small wooden airplane on the table. It was the same airplane Noah had given her years earlier. Marcus stared at it, remembering the lonely little girl who had once held a photograph of her mother and wondered if anyone would ever come for her. Grace smiled through tears and told him that he had been the first person who made her believe she was worth staying for. Marcus could not answer. He simply reached across the table and held her hand. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Marcus walked to the window and watched snow falling over Chicago. He thought about how close he had come to believing that his own life was too difficult to help someone else. He had once thought kindness required money, time, or some extraordinary sacrifice. But he had learned the truth. Sometimes kindness is simply sitting beside someone when they are alone. Sometimes it is sharing a toy when you have very little. Sometimes it is opening your door even when your own life is not perfect. And sometimes the person you think you are saving is actually the person who will save a piece of you. If this story touched your heart, please support the video with a like, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe so more stories of kindness and hope can reach people who need them. Before the story ends, leave a comment saying, "Kindness always comes back." Your words might remind someone who is struggling today that they are not invisible. Marcus never became a billionaire. He never owned a mansion or drove an expensive car. But on that Christmas morning, surrounded by Noah and Grace, he realized something far more valuable than money. He had built a home where 3 wounded hearts had found one another, and somehow, against all odds, they had become whole together. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, the lights on the Christmas tree glowed softly. And for the first time in years, Marcus looked at the empty chair beside the table and smiled, because there was no longer anyone missing. Everyone who belonged was home,